A Labor of Stitches by Lacey Decker Hawthorne. A labor of stitches is made of 2 cloth sails and the stitches that join them. The sails hang back to back, one red, one white, sewn together as quilts are. They are neither sail or quilt, but both. We are between sheets and quilts as we travel by night in dreams. We are between cloth sails on a boat as we travel across water by day. The labor of a quilt and its uncountable stitches are here grown larger, sail size, magnifying the generations of hands which threaded them together. Standing inside the sail's enclosure, I hope you feel both some of the protection of a quilt at night and the snap of a sail in the wind off the water. When I began to sew these sails, I gathered meters of cloth, bolts of red and white, thick cotton thread for hand sewing, and a tool for marking creases, batting meant for 2 twin beds. I spread everything out on 6 tables in a church hall and began hours of smoothing, snipping, taping, and pinning. When all the layers were lightly held together, I tucked it into a big flowered carpet bag, its loose cotton corners draping over the edge, and brought it home. I laid it out on the floor, my kitchen table, shifting it around the house, as no room could accommodate its full 15-foot size. I tried to imagine how many stitches it needed, how much labor it would take to make it whole. But I was asking the wrong question. What kind of stitches did it need? The long red diagonals that dart up the white sail are tacking stitches. This stitch, is the most private and transient kind. Tacks are only meant to hold the quilt layers together, while the more refined, permanent stitching happens over and around them. Only the quilt maker sees these kind of stitches. It is a private stitch for an often private bed-bound object. Yet tacking is also the action of changing course on a sailboat by turning a boat's head into and through the wind. You head crossways to the wind at a diagonal, back and forth, to tack your way home. The word tack derives from the Old French tâche, meaning to clasp. To clasp a sail heading home, to clasp layers of cloth together, hands clasping a quilt for warmth at night. This action of tacking, of clasping, is a way to draw these 2 kinds of labor closer together. I chose to use a labor as a collective noun for a vast number of stitches. Stitches that are so vast as to be uncountable in connection with the labors of the uncountable, mostly female hands which made them over generations. If every stitch is a syllable, I'd like to give voice to those phrases made by quiet labor. While boats at sea were tacking into the wind, yards of cloth were also being tacked together. For every sail raised up, there was a quilt laid down. These 2 ways of using cloth, for powering ships, for protection at night, show labor in its public and private spheres. Sails on ships brought workers, often men, out to sea to fish, to make a livelihood. The broad stretch of cloth caught the wind on the water, billowing the sail, bringing them further out on the fishing grounds or closer to home in the evening. Home on land, quilts patched and stitched hung on a clothesline, billowing in the same wind, releasing water from washing back into the air. For me, these images are inextricable from rural, coastal Newfoundland. Here, the wind is always sharp off the water. The water is salt, dark, clear. The fish in the boat are cod. The quilts are cloth from my grandmother's. When the women weren't making clothes or quilts or bread, they were out turning fish in the beaches. When the boats were quiet in winter, the men were darning nets. Both stitched a life and livelihood together. Both worked many labors of stitches. In season, fishermen would raise sails in the pre-dawn dark, the day lightening around them, fog hopefully not too thick. Those at home would slip out from under heavy quilts to light the fire and tend to the day's work, keeping one eye on the weather and the water. This rhythm is ancient, the sails pulling ships through the water by day, the quilts giving protection and warmth at night. Cloth was fitted to the mast in the daylight, and cloth was fitted to a bed after dark. In Greek myth, Penelope weaves and unweaves a cloth every night of Odysseus' absence, while he takes nearly 20 years to sail himself home. In many Western myths, women are always weaving, men are always sailing. Making cloth was often equated to making life with its own attendant labor. When I look at both the loom and the boat, I wonder how many stitches or how many tacks make a labor. How many labors are stitched to those threads? How many tacks in wind or in linen does it take to find warmth at home? These particular cloth sails of my making, hanging back to back from a tree, deliberately bring these uses and rhythms together. The quilt becomes the sail itself, both billowing in the breeze. Standing between them, made small by their height, are we at sea or asleep? A quilt tacked together and a sail tacking into the wind, both of these labors can be made indivisible. This indivisibility is mirrored in a quilt's making. Needle and thread repeatedly traverse layers of cloth and thick batting, making formerly separate things into one whole. They are joined together by uncountable labors of small stitches, one accumulating after the other, and the whole becoming greater than the sum of its parts. In its making, the labor of the hand joins the labor of the needle, my foot on the pedal, the cloth warm in my lap. When I sit sewing at my table, 15 feet of sail quilt in my lap, I am reminded of what the writer John Berger calls a sense of vertical continuity. The same weight and heft of cloth would have filled the laps of my grandmothers and grandmothers before them. They would have felt the same tug of the needle, the same almost inaudible shush of the thread, made the same squint when slipping thread through an eye in low light. But I cannot guess their thoughts while they worked at the cloth. For all of them, the making of it would have been a practicality of survival. Making clothes for the children, quilts to keep us all warm at night and through the winter. I grew up very near both grandmothers and a great-grandmother, all of whom gave up sewing, knitting, rug cooking, and mending when they were able, mostly when all the children grew up and left home. It must have been a relief or a small miracle to just buy a blanket, a sweater, or socks. But since they're not on this side anymore, I like to keep my needle threaded and pile up cloth in my lap to keep warm. Repeating their same motions, threading, knotting, stitching, in order to keep contact with that vertical continuity. In keeping their work in my heart and mind and in my hands, something of those long lines of labor remains present in my own work, and something in that echo of repetition keeps a thread taut with the past. They might affectionately scoff at my doing this when I don't have to, or tisk at my slow handwork, but I like to think they'd be pleased at my making their labors visible, making their work as big as the sails coming home off the water.